to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, with us, we have a special guest, Robert Joel Silverman, who is a senior foreign service officer with 18 years of overseas experience. He is also affiliated with the Jerusalem with the JISS. He is also the chief editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, a lecturer at Shalom College and University of Haifa, and has experience with inter-Jewish Muslim Alliance and other interfaith groups. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Irina.
And we'll be discussing the article that you wrote that sparked my interest at this time.
Okay.
The article was about the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. So
Right.
we'll get to what that means, but before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience, and how you ended up in this particular area, working in the interfaith sector, coming in from foreign service experience. And
Thank you, Irina. Well, it's a pleasure and honor to be with you on this program and to discuss this issue. My background is I'm a Jewish kid from Des Moines, Iowa. Don't ask how that happened, but there are such people. And I was also always fascinated with the Middle East. I spent some years of high school in Israel. I majored in Middle East studies and Arabic in college and graduate school, as well as getting a law degree. I did graduate work in Cairo. Then after some years of law practice, I joined the Foreign Service, where I was able to really dig into the Middle East. And I have served in the U.S. embassies everywhere in the Middle East, frankly, that the U.S. has diplomatic representation, which is to say everywhere but Iran. And so I have direct firsthand experience with the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in Egypt, and I'm happy to describe that. But after leaving the Foreign Service, as you mentioned, I got involved in interfaith work. I was asked by the American Jewish Committee to set up their first ever domestic American outreach program to Muslims. So I set up a program with that. You were part of that. You are part of that, perhaps. I did that for a few years up in New York. And then, fancy-free person that I am, I moved to Israel, and that's where I am now.
That's wonderful. That gives a great background for your and context for your work. So let's start with the basics, though. What and who is and are the Muslim Brotherhood?
Right. Yeah, it's hard to pin down, and that's you're from the former Soviet Union, so as the communists used to say, it's not by coincidence that, right? No, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt, 1928, by a school teacher. It was a few years after the Caliphate, which, as everyone who knows history will recall, it was the Ottoman Sultan also had the title of Caliph, which is a religious position. And that position was abolished by the Republicans in Turkey, led by Ataturk, in 1923. I'm sorry, in 1923, it started to be abolished. It was finally abolished in 24. So this organization came about as a way of restoring a caliphate, a single Islamic entity. And it was based and remains based on Islamic fundamentalist vision of a return to a pristine Islam. One country, eventually the whole world, under one ruler who is a rightly guided Muslim leader, applying Islamic law to all Muslims and eventually the whole world. So that was the vision. It was in reaction to the abolishing of the existing caliphate in Turkey. And so that it began as an Egyptian organization and remained for its first few decades as an Egyptian organization that had a militia that openly espoused violence and public and political assassinations. The Muslim Brotherhood assassinated an Egyptian prime minister at one point. They developed their own separate army, separate from the Egyptian army, which invaded Palestine in 48 after the British left, and Israel declared a state. So the Muslim Brotherhood had its own separate military army of volunteers fighting in Palestine in 48 against the Jews there. And now, just to give you the full history, it was suppressed by Nasser. And they attempted, the Muslim Brotherhood, to assassinate Nasser in 1954. While he was giving a famous speech in Alexandria, shots rang out, people were arrested. It was tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. They were suppressed. Since 54 in Egypt, they have been more or less underground, sometimes very much underground, and other times they are operating under different names that everyone knows is actually the Muslim Brotherhood. But also what happened in the 50s, Irina, is it started to branch out to other places. So it became an international organization, still based in Cairo, with a hierarchy there, with a council of elders, a shura council, and a supreme guide. Very much on like some other Muslim organizations, for instance, Sufi orders, that have different levels of people. But this quickly became an international organization with national chapters. Sudan, the countries around Egypt are the ones that had the first naturally. Libya has a strong Muslim Brotherhood organization. Sudan has a very strong one that actually penetrated and took over the army at one and remains very much tied to the army in Sudan. And of course, we know that starting in the 70s, they developed offshoots in Gaza and the West Bank. Both the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas are offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West Bank and Gaza. And Hamas, says so in its charter, that it is in Article 2, says it's part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it follows the rules of the Muslim Brotherhood. And not just ideology, but also means. And is, of course, a very violent organization. So there are places where the Muslim Brotherhood does not have a violent terrorist affiliate part of it, other places it does. And so it goes place by place, but it is an international organization with an Egyptian leadership.
So let's ask ourselves this question. When
Yeah.
it first emerged, who was supposed to be that caliph that they aspired to place on top of the territory
Yeah.
that they were hoping to unite? Because we hear a lot about this concept of the caliphate, but we don't talk about who is supposed to actually lead it.
Right. And they're unclear about that. It's supposed to be the most outstanding Muslim of the time. They've never reached a point, unlike ISIS, which actually declared a caliphate, right? The Muslim Brotherhood has never taken that final step of doing that. It is waiting. It is trying to first overturn the who they consider to be the corrupt, evil rulers in the Middle East. Secular Muslims. This is the reason they tried to assassinate Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a secular nationalist. They're opposed to secular nationalism. They don't believe, and including Hamas. People wrongly say about Hamas that it is only interested in Palestinian statehood. It is not. And it has corrected, its leadership has corrected that record online in TV broadcasts. It says, no. That is just one step towards an Islamic state. So, all of these Islamist groups share some goals of, some have different tactics, some have different timelines. As you saw, that Islamic State doesn't want to raid around, wants to declare a state in the areas it's liberated first and then expand them. The Muslim Brotherhood believes in first liberating the Muslim countries that exist, and then later declaring the caliphate. So, but those are tactical differences. The goals are the same. the key for us to understand about the Muslim Brotherhood is it is a violent organization. It is not just an ideology that people would hope to happen someday, God willing. They have different styles of achieving their goals in different countries and at different times. But violence and use of terrorist methods is definitely a part of their toolkit. And they use it whenever they feel it's a good time to use that, including quite recently in Egypt.
So interestingly enough, you mentioned that it's supposed to be the quote unquote best, most excellent Muslim,
Right.
that's supposed to be on top. Who defines that, and how would they?
Right.
They're first of all, they're even based on whatever the criteria they use, there could be more than one candidate. Someone who's
Right.
particularly zealous, particularly accomplished in promoting the cause of the Islamic
Right.
caliphate. And second, what would the caliphate be like? Because we know what the Ottoman Empire was like. Would it be something like the Ottoman Empire? Because based on that, they would have, a pretty decent tolerance for Jews, because at various points in time, the Ottoman Empire did. But it
Yeah.
doesn't sound like that may be the case, given their activity in 1948
Yeah.
and afterwards.
No, I mean, and by the way, uh, I guess this is considered a good thing. First of all, it sounds like you've been reading your Islamic history, because yes, of course, there's always multiple candidates for the top job, right? I mean, there's rival caliphates even, right? There was a caliphate in Spain and a caliphate in Baghdad at the same time, and there was another caliphate, in Cairo. There were three at one point, all rival, all calling themselves caliphs. So yes, it has happened in the past, but the Muslim Brotherhood, no, does not consider the Ottoman Empire to be the ideal. It, like all of what you call Salafiyun, the people who look back to the pristine Islam, you can call them fundamentalists of sort. Their ideal Muslim state was the first one, the one that was based in Medina, that had Muhammad as its ruler, and so of course he was a conqueror, and non-Muslims were somewhat tolerated, but mainly they converted to Islam in that first state, and that's the goal. I mean, the goal is, and I don't disparage people that have goals that consider their own religion to be the superior one, and eventually someday in some far distant future to be the supreme one, ruling the earth. Everyone, will recognize it. But the question is, how do you get there? And for the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't want to emphasize it's a religious ideology too much, because frankly, it's a political group. It uses religion to overthrow governments and establish what it wants. So it's a political group that uses Islam, and it has had various Muslim theorists who propound its ideology. Over time, there have been a series of them, mostly Egyptians, but not always, that have included most recently Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was an Egyptian cleric based in Qatar. You had Tariq Ramadan, an Egyptian based in Geneva, and before that, Paris. You've had Sayyid Qutb, who was hung by Nasser in 1966 in Cairo. So you can go back and read their ideology, but I would put less stress on the religious aspects of it, because they're cynically using the religion, because part of what they are doing is appealing to other Muslims to saying, we are the right path. Now, there are a variety of forms of Islam out there, but the Muslim Brotherhood believes it is the only right one. And so to be a true believer, you have to go along with them and their political goals. And so they make the case that they are the pure, the righteous, and follow them. And eventually, one way or another, we're going to have a caliph and an Islamic state. And that's kind of vague as to when that happens and how that happens. But the key is overthrowing and replacing the existing rule, starting in the existing Arab and Muslim countries. So it's a political group. I don't want to make a perfect ideology, but Ku Klux Klan uses Christian ideology, and you can try to parse, their Christianity, but it's kind of useless, right? I mean, Ku Klux Klan is a terrorist group, domestic one, but it has political goals and it uses religion. I would say the same thing about the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a political group. It was founded with a political agenda. You became a member of the Muslim Brotherhood by placing your hand on a gun and the gun in the hand on a Quran, and you gave an oath to follow the supreme guide and establish Islamic law. And so, like a lot of other political groups, they cynically use religion.
So interestingly enough, when you mentioned that Muslim Brotherhood was fighting Israel in 1948, this is a little discussed chapter of history, because most of what we know about Israel's conflicts with the Arab world at the time was framed as a pan-Arabist unity against a Zionist entity,
Right.
essentially, and so on and so forth. It's talked about in terms of nationalism, in terms of Arab states who were involved. It does not talk about a movement which explicitly uses religious rather than nationalist rhetoric as its calling card. And so let's look at that and how did that relationship work? Because Muslim Brotherhood, as you mentioned, was also anti-nationalist. It was against Nasser. It was against the very states that it was that were taking place in that conflict.
Right.
What was the dynamic? How was it?
I have to give credit to the Muslim Brotherhood. They can be very flexible to achieve their goals. And they're prepared to work with secular nationalists at certain times and then turn around and oppose them later. But when they set up, they recruited an army. I forget the name. I think it was called the Army of Salvation. Basically in the streets of Egypt. It was mostly Egyptian volunteers. And they actually preceded the Egyptian army in crossing the border, of Sinai and into what was then British Mandatory Palestine. So they were before. They invaded what was to become the Jewish state of Israel, before the Egyptian army crossed the border. They had already infiltrated. But when Israel declared its statehood, its independence in May 14th, there was already a Muslim Brotherhood army on the ground in and around, this area that we're now so focused on, what the Israelis call the Gaza envelope, the northern Negev. They were already there. Now, was it a well-equipped army? No, it was a bunch of volunteers with rifles and machine guns. They didn't have tanks, but they had thousands of volunteers, and they cooperated, with the Egyptian army at that point in fighting the Jews. Now they can cooperate with Arab secular nationalists in fighting the Jews, and then turn around and fight the secular nationalists too, which they did. So they're very flexible. To fight them and to combat them, I recommend adopting some of the tactical flexibility that they use. In certain countries where there are Muslim Brotherhood chapters, they're very much just a regular political party, anti-Semitic, anti-American, et cetera, that the ideology is similar, but they don't always use terrorism. In Jordan, they're an important opposition party. In Morocco, they're an important opposition party. In Tunisia, the offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood there actually renounced violence. I think it's the only case that has happened. It's called a Nahda. They go by different names in different places. And so it's tactically flexible. It uses violence when they deem it to be the most effective tool. They use participation in democracy as another tool. They've been very successful in some places and not so successful elsewhere. I would say they've been extremely successful in Sudan. People forget, that they were allied starting in 1981 when there was a military strongman who ruled Sudan, Colonel Numeri. He allied with the Sudanese Muslim Brotherhood and its leader. And then the army that he controlled became fully infiltrated by the Muslim Brotherhood and remains to this day, basically 45 years later, very much attached to. So all of the violence that happened by the Sudanese military, to include, frankly, a genocide in Darfur, is working with the Muslim Brotherhood there to promote and advance Islamicist goals in Sudan. Now, in Sudan, when there was a popular revolt, about 10 years ago, that was against them, not just the government, but against the Muslim Brotherhood-controlled army. It's a very different country, Sudan, than Egypt. In Egypt, the army is the secular nationalist icon, right?
Mm-hmm.
People see the army in Egypt as sort of the paragon of national virtue or something, right? Defending the nation. In Sudan, it doesn't have that same stature, the army. And it has, to gain stature, it formed an alliance with this popular Muslim group that had deep roots in Sudan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and is now, in effect, following the orders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan, which is, again, allied with the mother headquarters in Cairo of the Egyptian International Organization.
Regardless of its tactics and occasional flexibility in political means, though, certain pillars of its ideology remain pretty much solid, no matter the time
Yes.
or the place.
Oh, yes. Oh,
And
yes.
this anti-Israel opposition, is not new. It didn't start with Hamas.
No.
Started
No.
decades ago, and that is something that I think is nearly forgotten because people imagine that it started with Hamas, that it was a
No.
consequence of the Cold War, opposition
No.
between the Soviet-backed PLO and the Islamists, but in reality, it goes back that
Yeah, it's at the
anti-Israel.
heart. And they're able to draw. Let's remember these religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism,
Mhm.
they have various strands, and and you can pick and choose various things in the tradition. And Islam has an anti-Semitic tradition. Is it necessarily the dominant one? No, not necessarily. But there are anti-Semitic, strands in the Muslim tradition, and the Muslim Brotherhood has chosen those and elevated them and made them a key part of its ideology. And they're not lying. This is there in the tradition, but there's also pro-Jewish things in the Islamic tradition. There's a lot of that. They ignore that part,
So
and they
why?
choose what?
The question is, why did they choose to focus on that and make it such a distinctive part of their
Yeah.
ideological appeal? Why focus on the negative as opposed to unite the Muslims around, for instance, the concept of charity and all wonderful
Yes,
things and so on and so forth?
yes. Well, I mean, that's a great question. I'm not a spokesperson for them, but they drew on the anti-Semitic elements that are there in the tradition, and it was part of the feeling, I think, of defensiveness that many Muslims found themselves in starting, early in the last century, in the 20th century. Most of these countries, Egypt included, were basically governed by European powers, sometimes with a local facade of autonomy. Like in Egypt, they had a khedive and then a sultan and then a king. But the British were the power behind the throne there, and they were anti-Western. And as part of that, they were also anti-Jewish, strongly so. I mean, viciously so. And then, of course, Zionism came along, and they saw that as a challenge. More than a challenge, it was an opportunity to recruit and and energize the masses. So, and they drew on, at the time, remember, the Muslim Brotherhood really came alive in the 30s. They drew on Nazi and fascist ideology from Europe. They directly imported that. They found strands in their own tradition and in European fascism, and they melded it together, and it's part of their ideology. Sorry to say, and I'll give you a concrete example of how they do that. So, and I mentioned this in the article. 20 years ago, during the second Intifada that broke out, there were a huge number of suicide bomb attacks. They killed, frankly, several thousand, I think up to 4,000 Israeli civilians were killed on public buses, in hospitals, in public places. Young Islamic Hamas members would go and, with the suicide belt and blow themselves up. Now, a lot of Muslim clerics said, that's very un-Islamic, because it's quite clear in the rules of warfare in Islam, starting with the Prophet Muhammad, you're not allowed to target civilians. But then the main Muslim cleric, the main sheikh, if you would, of the Muslim Brotherhood, this Egyptian cleric named Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who had fled Egypt to Qatar, he came out with what he called a ruling, a juridical ruling, that all Israelis are combatants, elderly, babies, children, women, men, doesn't matter. They're all combatants and they're all fair game. And therefore, he sanctioned these suicide attacks. And in his opinion, and he was a preacher, right? I mean, he had his own show. He passed away about 10 years ago, but this is 20 years ago, during the Second Intifada. He had a very famous and widely watched TV show on Al Jazeera. It was called Ask the Imam. It's sort of like, ask the rabbi a question, and he would give you a quick religious answer. And so he gave the religious answer for the Muslim Brotherhood that it's okay, it's sanctioned to kill Israeli civilians. They're all combatants. And that, to me, helps explain why Hamas last year on October 7th was so proud and so celebratory. When the Nazis killed Jews, they didn't necessarily put it in the newspapers, right? And send they didn't have the media, they didn't have social media at the time, but they kept it hidden. Hamas certainly didn't. Hamas was very proud, and they passed it. They put it on the internet, and beheadings and all kinds of barbaric things were placed on the internet, and they were proud because they were killing people that their Muslim Brotherhood said that you're supposed to kill. Israelis, citizens, civilians. And of course, that includes other Muslims, because among the 1,200 people killed that day were some 45 Israeli Muslims who happened to be in and around that area, who were captured, whose native language is Arabic, and who pled for their lives, and they were killed as well. So look, these are barbarians. We saw that, but they have an ideology, and they have political goals, and they have an organization to further it. And that is why I wrote the article.
So here's the question. As you mentioned, this is not a new idea. There's been efforts to designate the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in the US. And by the way, there's a number of countries that has formally designated the Muslim Brotherhood. US is not one of them, but there's a group. So the question is, what is it that legally and politically prevented that from happening many years ago, given this long history of violence, of ideological support for violence, for outright sanctioning of terrorism and suicide bombings and so forth?
Well, it's a great question, Irina, and there's a simple, quick answer and a longer one, but let me start with the simple. The simple one is, this is the US law. Let's talk about the US measure.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite simple and easy to do. The law says the Secretary of State has the authority to
Mm-hmm.
designate a foreign-based organization that meets the definition of terrorism, and this started in 1997. At the time, Al-Qaeda was starting to blow up embassies and eventually, created a series of attacks. So this was the reaction to the terrorism that was happening in the late 90s. And so it's the Secretary of State can do this. It doesn't require Congress. It doesn't require any big meeting. It's a technical matter. What a Secretary of State can come in and turn to his or her counterterrorism bureau within the State Department and ask them, provide me a memo that lays out the case for designating the Muslim Brotherhood. They know how to do these memos. The counterterrorism experts in the State Department produce such a memo. They may get clearance or not required from other parts of the US government, because this is a decision of the Secretary of State. They give a memo that with a box, approve or not approve. The Secretary of State approves, checks the box, it is done. And that's all that's required. In the first Trump administration, this was tried. The White House wanted it to happen. Senior people, came into government seeking to do this, and the then Secretary of State, Tillerson, blocked it. So it didn't happen because Tillerson blocked it. Simple. Also, there were around this time and before then, congressional bills that went forward, but the congressional bills are not doing this. They were what they call sense of Congress resolutions, saying the Congress, believes this should happen and asks the Secretary of State to report back. But the law is very clear. This is a call of the Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not, Congress can't do it on its own. It can urge the Secretary of State or the administration to do this and require a report as to why or why not, but it's up to the Secretary of State. So it didn't happen under Trump 1 because you had a Secretary of State who disagreed with his White House.
But Tillerson was
just
there for
blocked it.
only for a year. Secretary Pompeo seemed a lot more hawkish
Yeah.
on such issues. What didn't happen with Pompeo?
Well, you should ask him. You should put him on the show and ask him. I think by that time he had other fish to fry. It was misrepresented also. Like I said, it's a very simple process. It's a memo that goes to the Secretary of State from the Counterterrorism Bureau, and he approves it, and it's done. And I'll give you an example of how this did work.
Mm-hmm.
When you had a Secretary of State who was very much aligned with his White House, and that was the Biden administration, in literally almost the first thing Secretary of State Blinken did was he took off of the terrorism list the Houthis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did he have congressional support? No, he didn't. He didn't need congressional support. Did he have to convene the interagency? No, he just did it. He did it because he knew he had the confidence of his president. And now, it was a terrible decision, by the way, that one. It wasn't based on any counterterrorism or terrorism criteria. It was based on humanitarian goals that had nothing to do with what the Houthis' behavior was. As we've seen, they remain a terrorist group, in control of a country now. Maybe they're a state sponsor at this point, but in any case, they're doing terrorist activities. But they were taken off a list, and it was a very simple bureaucratic procedure. The Secretary of State did it, and that could happen again. You'd have whoever's president, come November 5 or come January 20th next year, if he or she has a Secretary of State who is, aligned with the White House, and the White House wants to do this, it happens, and that's done. Now, let me also say, Designation is only the first step. It
Sure.
has to be followed through. It has to be implemented. And that is often where the rubber hits the road. And that we can discuss what that would look like. But in short, it ran into bureaucratic opposition in 2017 from a Secretary of State who was opposed to it, who didn't understand it, frankly. He was being told at the time, I was not in government, but I didn't write all this in the article, so this I'm saying to you, but I'm not, writing it down in public. But Tillerson was misinformed. He had come out of ExxonMobil, which has a very deep and longstanding relationship with Qatar. It is the main contractor on the LNG, the liquefied natural gas projects in Qatar. And so he's had a long appreciation for the, sovereignty and the importance of that little country. And so he was misunderstanding that a foreign terrorist designation from the Muslim Brotherhood would necessarily cut off our relations with Qatar, which is false. It's false. Qatar has long hosted Hamas, which has always been on our terrorism list. If a designation of the Muslim Brotherhood would cut off relations with Qatar, it should have happened, 25 years ago, when Hamas was
Sure.
first put on the list, but it didn't. It doesn't. There's a separate process in the U.S. for state sponsors of terrorism, and that is a bigger process that has a foreign policy huge implication that would require interagency meetings at a minimum and a big discussion. It's a big step. The Trump people did that with the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and that was a big step. And so calling a government or elements of a government a state sponsor of terrorism is different than designating a foreign group as a foreign terrorist group. So those are two separate processes, and Tillerson, I think, was misinformed or didn't understand it and thought this would somehow be the end of our relationship with Qatar or something. It doesn't have to be that way at all.
So interestingly enough, following Tillerson's very brief tenure,
Yes.
under
Well, he was there for a year or so, right? Yeah.
we have seen that there was strong opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood, but I am still not sure whether the relevant officials, either under Trump or in Congress, are fully aware of the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was directly involved in violence and not merely backing financially different organizations. So I think legal distinction gets lost on a lot of the policymakers that can contribute to the confusion. So the question is, why is it that the Muslim Brotherhood violent activity in Africa, not only against Egyptians, but in Sudan and around against other people and various non-state abductions, assassinations in various parts of the world, why is it they're not taken as seriously as some other non-state actors who have been, for instance, at various points represented as such to the US. The Kurdish PKK, for instance, was at one point designated as a terrorist organization despite posing no danger to US interests directly. So that is the question of being US-centric. That's clearly not the issue. So what is the difference between the much larger Muslim Brotherhood, which spans many countries, and PKK, which is an extremely specific organization?
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I think there is a good way forward by looking at the PKK. So the PKK years ago, in the 70s, actually, did target Americans. They actually killed an American military attaché in Ankara, Turkey. The reason being, the PKK is a Kurdish nationalist group. It's, was founded in Moscow, actually, by, Kurdish separatists who were, indoctrinated into Marxism. And so it was a tool for a while, the USSR, against the NATO ally and member, Turkey. But it, since the fall of the Soviet Union, it has a life of its own, but because it did target and assassinate some Americans long ago, it was again a charter member like Hamas of the terrorism list in 1997. Now they have stopped targeting Americans, but they were never taken off the list. Maybe that's partly because the terrorism list says very clearly who should be on this list. Foreign-based organization that uses political violence, against, non-combatants, and this is where the PKK is relevant, either targets American nationals or American national security. So by their goal of seeking to overthrow Turkey, a NATO ally, the PKK remains a valid member on that list because, its goal would harm U.S. national security. And it does do political violence. And it is foreign-based. So it meets the criteria and remains on the list. Now, to complicate that picture, PKK remains on that list, but as I said, it hasn't been targeting American nationals for a long time. It has, like the Muslim Brotherhood, it has affiliates and national memberships. It's based in southern Turkey and northern Iraq. It has a much smaller but still existing organization in Iran and a large organization in northern Syria, where there are a lot of Kurds. And so its northern Syrian affiliate, it uses a Kurdish acronym, the YPG, is a U.S. tactical ally in the war against ISIS. It is the main element, when you see, Kobani and these, brave, courageous Kurdish women fighting to the death in the streets of Kobani, right? Those are literally people considered terrorists under they're affiliated with the PKK. They're the YPG. The YPG shares, just like the chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood do, their ultimate supreme boss is the Öcalan, the guy in prison in Turkey who's head of the PKK. If Öcalan has the same relationship with the YPG as the Muslim Brotherhood supreme guide has to, the Sudanese Muslim Brotherhood, which is committing violence. So the U.S. has shown itself, in the case of the PKK, to have the same kind of tactical flexibility to achieve its aims as the terrorists. So we can, on one hand, say, PKK, you remain on our terrorism list. You're trying to overthrow Turkey. That's a harm to U.S. national security. You use political violence as a tactic. You're on our terrorism list. Now, your affiliate in Syria is an ally of ours because you're fighting an even worse enemy, which is ISIS. So we're going to arm the Syrian affiliate of the PKK because it's tactically, we're not saying we're going to be allies forever, frankly, but as long as there's ISIS and, out there, we're going to work with the Syrian part of the PKK to fight ISIS. Okay. If we can do that, I think we can do something very similar with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is that the Muslim Brotherhood, it's foreign-based, it targets things that are opposed and uses political violence, among other tools, to harm U.S. national security. It's designated. We're going to pursue that. We're going to do all the things that mean. Ban them from entering the United States, expel its members in the United States, freeze bank accounts, you name it. Talk to its foreign sponsors about what that could mean for them down the road, while having, open meetings with branches of the Muslim Brotherhood that are peaceful, that can be aligned with from time to time in places like Jordan or Tunisia. Why not?
Well,
we do that with the PKK. We can do the
Wouldn't,
same thing with the Muslim Brotherhood. So
well,
that's what I advocate for.
wouldn't the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan undermine our national security interest in keeping the Jordanian monarchy in place, given the fact
Well,
that
yes,
they're
I'm just, you look, I don't want to overstate our ability to find tactical alliances with Muslim Brotherhood
because I
branches.
haven't seen the Muslim Brotherhood provide any sort of tactical assistance, even if they haven't always directly clashed with the US in every country, they shouldn't haven't been helpful in any way that I can think
You
of.
know, look, the Middle East is such a kaleidoscope of different peoples. Um, you know, this old saying, you know, that people like to think is true and but it's not, is, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's actually more the case, and this goes to the Muslim Brotherhood. The enemy of my enemy is another enemy that I will eventually get around to.
Mhm,
You know, so in Yemen, I'll cite one case. There is a Muslim Brotherhood chapter.
mhm.
It's called the Islamic Party. You know, they go by different names, different places. And it was aligned with it's against the Houthis, right?
Officially, it is. Unofficially, I'm hearing a very different story. But my
Sure.
point is, less about
So
any
look,
particular
I don't want to get into the details
chapters.
of
My bigger point is this. The
yeah,
bigger point is Muslim Brotherhood as such,
yeah,
regardless of the individual actions of assorted affiliates in various places at any given
right,
point in time, the
right.
Muslim Brotherhood as such has a very clear ideology, has very clear path,
Yes,
clearly espouses violence, clearly undercuts US national security interests in many places, and yet there has been a huge reluctance to deal even with that basic issue without getting drawn
right,
into the forest of which chapter is, violent and which isn't, and which
right.
chapter can be cooperate. Just on that very basic level, the heads
I
of it
mean,
who are very clearly pro violence, that it has met with huge opposition in the US bureaucratic circles, and for whatever
right,
reason, it has prevented even Secretary Pompeo from taking a very basic step that, as you yourself pointed out, is yet to be enforcement is a completely different story from even the basic designation to even
right,
send a message that the Muslim Brotherhood activity is overall discouraged by the United States. And that, to me,
right.
seems to be part of not only a simple bureaucratic battle, but an ideological battle that US is losing, in my opinion. If Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that is overall, by and large, espouses violence and has a record of blood on its hands, can force the US government or bully or discourage the US government from taking even a basic step to hold it accountable for its activity, we have a very, very big problem. And that brings me to the question of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States and
Right.
what impact, in your opinion, would it have on the current situation and the current set of circumstances to designate the Muslim Brotherhood, how it would
Right.
work in terms of not only enforcement, but the organizations affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood or financed by Muslim Brotherhood or in some way supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood, and what impact would it have on the current conflict?
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yes. Let me quickly go through what are the three different arguments against the designation, because
Mhm.
the most important of the three is the one you just raised, which is that its potential overbroad effect on American Muslims. And that's the most important of the three. But let's start with the other two very quickly, because we touched on this already. So when you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood designation, which hasn't gone through, and Pompeo didn't take it up, and it's never gotten very far in democratic administrations. There are three arguments against it. One is, and these are the so-called counterterrorism purists, they said it would dilute the list because it itself, the Muslim Brotherhood, again, an international organization that has different chapters, is not, its record of violence, particularly against Americans, is thin. And what we can do instead is just designate the violent wings of it and not address the mothership, the core
Mm-hmm.
organization. And I disagree with that, but that's an argument, and that's what,
Mm-hmm.
people in the Counterterrorism Bureau of the State Department will use that argument.
Mm-hmm.
If Secretary of State comes in and says, we're going to do this, they, oh, no, you can't, sir. This would dilute our list. Well, first of all, it's bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
I think because there is a record of violence, which I put out in that paper, which you read. So it's there. And the alternative, which is what has been done, is this whack-a-mole of, whenever there's a cutout, for the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, it comes, because they know our terrorism list. They know what would happen if we designated them. So they often don't claim attacks in their own name. They create some phony organization, the Four Arms of Egypt is one. And then they blow up a police station,
Mm-hmm.
or they attack a foreign embassy in Cairo under the name of this foreign group. And not but the foreign group turns out, analysts will tell you, to be directly, set up by the Muslim Brotherhood as a front. So, so they're trying to avoid this designation by doing this, but
Sure.
people want to play along with that. Okay, we're going to designate these various other things, but not the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, the Europeans did something similar to that on Hezbollah. The Americans have always said Hezbollah is one organization. It's not a political group and a terrorist group. It is run by the same people. And the Europeans would often say, no, we want to have relations with the political part of the Hezbollah, so we can't designate them. Well, they eventually realized that was false, but it took many, many years and a lot of discussions. Similarly, with the Muslim Brotherhood, it is an international organization. It is run by Egyptians. I'm sorry to say this, and it needs to be designated. So the first one is, and by the way, if people were so concerned about diluting it, why did they take the Houthis off of the list for completely reasons that have nothing to do with counterterrorism? So, and no one objected to that, right? So the idea that you're somehow politicizing this is one argument, or diluting the list. And like I said, it can be addressed and overruled. The second one is the one is again a foreign policy argument. Oh, this will hurt our relations throughout the Muslim world because it looks like we're against Muslims. Now, that's what the Muslim Brotherhood will say. But it's up to the U.S. public diplomacy to say, no. We're designating a violent group that engages in, horrible attacks and funds and supports suicide attacks. We're not against all Muslims. And, like I said, you can continue to have relations if you want, if there need be. And I used to participate in all these. They're of limited value, frankly. But, people want to meet with the Muslim Brotherhood of Jordan while we're designated, the group, fine. Good luck to them in those meetings. But so the foreign policy argument is still out there. Oh no, this will have an effect on our relations.
Arguably, there is a counter argument in that a group of Muslim countries came out in support of U.S. Designating Muslim Brotherhood, and arguably Muslims are the biggest victims of that violence because,
Of course.
So yeah, I don't really see why that.
No, you're absolutely right. There are counter arguments exactly like that. But let's get to the third thing, because that is the heart of it. The real objection would be civil liberties organizations, human rights organizations in the U.S. And they'll look at this similar to the Patriot Act, that this would, basically criminalize, fundamentalist Islam in the United States. So,
it would criminalize particular actions. It would not criminalize believing in whatever you want to believe. It would criminalize funding Hamas or funding Muslim Brotherhood or receiving funds from these organizations and using them for, activity that's not in line with U.S. law or U.S. national security concerns. But it wouldn't. I don't see what impact it would have that any other. Designation of mafia as an organized criminal organization would have on the Italian population.
Right. Well, I'm just giving you that argument because that is out there. I think a lot of people don't trust the US government to implement this carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Look, if you'd asked me 6 years ago, 7 years ago about this, when it was first introduced in Congress as a
Mm-hmm.
sense of Congress resolution, I
Sure.
would probably opposed it for
Mm-hmm.
the third reason, for the
Mm-hmm.
potential effect on American Muslims, chilling effect on their, First Amendment freedom of religion, free exercise of religion, because I will be honest. This is a valid concern.
Mm-hmm.
The Patriot Act did lead to some abuses. Frankly, we have to be cognizant of that and learn from
Mm-hmm.
that. But I come out differently now on this, because I think people do need to continue to not get stuck in their ideological trenches, but look at the world and how it's changing.
Mm-hmm.
And the Muslim Brotherhood is funding all kinds of protests all over the United States now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a huge surge of anti-Semitism, and that is organized. That's not spontaneous violence
Mm-hmm.
of a handful of agitators. No, no, no. I mean, this was organized and funded, and sometimes by terrorist groups that also use violence. And so when they also resort to violence, they can be designated, and their bank accounts can be seized. They can be deported if they're foreign nationals. And these things I think and a designation does that. Now, not on its own. Again, the designation is a box that the Secretary of State checks on a memo saying, I approve this. And, it's a press statement, so that when you click on the list, you see now the Muslim Brotherhood. What makes it happen is someone overseeing it who says to all of the various US government agencies in the law enforcement realm, okay, you now have 90 days to produce the regulations. US Treasury, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, many others, the border control people. All of these agencies now need to reflect the Muslim Brotherhood in its regulations and all of the panoply of ways. And I'll give you one really important one that most people don't think about. When you go to a mosque in the United States, and I've been to many, many, who is the imam there? Who is the preacher that gives the Friday sermon,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, they are often, I don't have the statistics, but in my experience, usually someone whose credentials, religious training has come from overseas, because there's only a couple places in the US where you can become an imam. It's actually only one now. It's this place in California. So there are no Islamic seminaries in the United States. So they're often from Al-Azhar, the huge seminary in Cairo. But they can be from Tunisia, they can be from Turkey. Depends on the way they come to the US. They get an expedited immigrant visa called special religious workers. And if you are a Muslim community in Arkansas and you want to hire an imam from overseas, you can petition and say, we have so-and-so, and from Al-Azhar University in Cairo, we want him to be our imam. And then that person comes in on an immigrant visa, a very expedited status, because he's needed by a community and there's a gap and there's no local person. That is how the great majority. Now, if there's a Muslim Brotherhood designation, there's an additional step now, which is that there will have to be some checks to make sure that these imams are not affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They can't come to the US and immigrate if they have that affiliation. Now, right now, they can. And many do, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a whole organization called Memory, whose whole business model is going into mosques and recording what's in Friday sermons in the United States. And it's often horrible stuff. And why is that? It's because we've imported a bunch of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated imams. That needs to stop, and a designation would stop that if it was enforced well.
So what would the enforcement mechanisms look like?
Yeah. Well, you would have, again, it would be a State Department centered process, likely, because the law is clear on the designation part of that. But it could be done in the NSC also. But you convene the groups that they meet for other reasons on other things and have periodic meetings to how's it going. You need to check and monitor. And someone needs to keep score. Oh, U.S. Treasury, how many bank accounts have you frozen? Have you done Yasin al-Qadi in Istanbul? Oh, have you worked with the people in Bosnia to do Mr. X? Have you talked to the people in Malaysia about Mr. Y? So there needs to be follow-up because the law is now clear. You can do this, but just because you can do it doesn't mean it happens. And by the way, that's the secret and fourth reason why it hasn't happened, because this is a lot of work. And the bureaucrats don't like to do new things. They're busy already, they feel. So the real reason it probably hasn't happened is not because of its effect on American Muslims and not because, it would be bad for our Islamic public diplomacy or, somehow politicize our terrorism list. No, the real fourth reason is bureaucrats resist, difficult, complex procedures, and this would be one of those, although this would be super beneficial for all Americans, frankly, including American Muslims. American Muslims don't want to be tied to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't be. The Muslim Brotherhood claims that they, represent all Muslims, but it's not true, of course. And by the way, in a strange way, some of these groups, that monitor the Muslim Brotherhood reinforce unintentionally this notion that they are the great force. They're not. There are many other, Sufis and other groups out there who are peaceful, Muslims, and just the average American Muslim who goes to mosque occasionally. So what? It's fine. And they don't need to be tarred by this organization that is anti-American, anti-Semitic, engages in violence. So if you attack them and do it the right way, and avoid some of the abuses, not everyone with a beard and prayer beads that shows up on a Friday mosque needs to be considered a Muslim Brotherhood member. But if they're raising funds for a group that has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, yes, they are now engaged in material support for terrorism, and that needs to stop. So the activities need to be crystal clear, and you need good public diplomacy inside the United States to tell people. I hate to use a bad analogy. We need a Yusuf Qaradawi to say to the American average person, here's what's forbidden and here's what's okay.
Sure.
And recruiting people for jihad in Afghanistan or something, using Muslim Brotherhood channels for that recruitment is not okay. Talking about the need for a Muslim state someday is okay, but you need to separate what is okay and what is not okay. And so people need to know that, because right now it's muddied, and the Muslim Brotherhood benefits from that lack of clarity because they are clearly on the rise in the United States.
So there's been a plethora of literature about Muslim Brotherhood, its activities specifically in the US. There's been experts coming out and testifying to assorted congressional committees. Clearly, the people who can do the explanation are there. They exist.
Yes.
What is the problem in communicating a simple, direct message institutionally? First of all, who should be doing that? Should it be the Secretary of State? Should it be the Department of Justice? Or who should be doing the communications on this, and why?
I think
why is it so difficult?
Well, it starts with the president. If you're going to do this and really implement it well, you can look at what President Bush did after 9/11. He was very smart about this. People have cited this. He went to a mosque, at the same time that they were in the process of passing the Patriot Act. He went to a mosque and says, our war is not with Islam. And he gave a speech. And that was very important. And so it starts with the president setting the right tone. Let's say it's President Trump now. Last week he went on October 7th, actually this week, to the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and that was a very powerful signal to the American Jewish community about his, support for them. Likewise, a future President Trump who's about to sign measures that will criminalize raising funds and organizing on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood inside the United States should go to a mosque and give a speech there and say, look, our war is not with Islam. It's with an ideology that is violent, that
I fully
does
agree
X and Y.
that this.
And so it starts with the president, but others need to do it as well.
But here's the problem specifically with President Trump. He nicknamed the restrictions on several countries known for extremism as a Muslim ban, and regardless of whether it was and it wasn't, and it clearly wasn't, because it included countries like North Korea and Venezuela and excluded a number of Muslim majority. This is the perception that has now been cemented, and this is the message that he clearly wanted to get to a particular demographic of his voters. And now that creates all sorts of problems with, doing anything substantive that really does restrict extremist activity based on this particular political brand.
Well, and just like, if Trump does win and does enact this kind of measure, which I think there's a good, strong possibility that he will, but I don't know for sure, of course, no one does, but we have to assume that basically almost anything he does will be criticized in the press, because they're the hunting expression, when you go hunting, you load your weapon. So the media is loaded for bear, or they're loaded for Trump. They're out to shoot Trump. So in a figurative sense. So they're going to be opposed to Trump no matter what he does or says. But you need to get beyond that. There's going to be plenty of objections to it, and including, of course, by Muslim Brotherhood supporters in our media, in our think tanks, in our human rights organizations. They've infiltrated all. It's incredible that it has, but it is. So they're going to be loaded for bear, as the hunting analogy goes, and that's fine. It's a free country, and they have the right to express themselves the way they want. But they cannot provide material support to what's now a terrorist group. And so it needs to be clear what is, they just people need to stick to their guns and do this. America will benefit from it, and overseas countries will too. And just as we did with Hezbollah, Hezbollah is not just a terrorist group, it's a criminal enterprise.
Sure.
It's narcotic smuggling. It's, they do human trafficking. They raise money in all kinds of criminal ways. It's a criminal network too. They use Lebanese Shiite overseas communities in Latin America to do all kinds of, money-making enterprises that benefit their terrorism. Well, the Europeans didn't want to recognize this, even though it was happening in their countries. And it took years, but eventually they got on board. And I think similarly on Muslim Brotherhood, I think the Germany, the Netherlands, the France will eventually realize, once the US does this, and shows, and by the way, Britain, there's a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood centered now in Manchester, in London, that needs to be dried up. I think if the US starts, others will follow. And, yes, it'll be nice to have the support of some Middle East countries that have already outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the only European country that has is Austria right now. I'd have to check that. That's a quick Google check, of course. But again, the Muslim Brotherhood operates under different names in different places. They're not idiots.
Sure.
They study the U.S. very well. The reason they don't claim violent attacks in their own name is they don't want to be on our terrorism list.
Sure, of course. That
I
makes
know this.
sense.
I used to meet with them in Cairo. You know, all these people, so-called counterterrorism experts, blah, 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 who don't speak Arabic. I've actually met with Muslim Brotherhood people. I was the designated person in the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, 1997 to 2000. They were an underground organization then, but of course they had known affiliates in the professional syndicates. You know, they didn't call them. There was no, oh, let's go see the Muslim Brotherhood office. No, no, no. There was they had they operated under different names and under different political parties. The Labor Party being one of their you know, one of their fronts. But I met with them regularly, and I know their thinking, and they study the U.S. very well, and they make it very hard to pin them down, which is why our bureaucrats don't want to be in charged with it.
Well, you just pointed out something very important. You yourself said that they studied the US very well, and in fact, some of them have been in the US for decades.
Right.
But our understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood, their ideology, their operational structure, I don't mean Hamas operational structure, I mean Muslim Brotherhood operational structure seems to be not a priority. Shouldn't, at the very least, we have some resources dedicated to at least understanding the problem if we rather than just merely dismissing it. I mean, fine, those people want to make the argument, oh, it can have a deleterious effect, but shouldn't we at least have an understanding and formal study of this organization, both formally with these counterterrorism experts and academically and publicly? Wouldn't that
Oh, I
be?
think so. But I wouldn't agree with that completely, but I would not put that a preconditioning to
Sure,
action.
no. I'm not saying as a
The best way to know about them is
Mhm.
to start asking the Treasury to freeze their bank accounts, because you learn a lot about, you know, through the process of sanctioning them. You know, one thing leads to another, leads to another, and leads to another. You learn it. You know, we already know a lot, frankly, in the intelligence channels.
Sure.
But you're right, there needs to be more understanding. I mean, I don't think it's been clear. ADL put out one report, you know, who was behind the funding for all these campus October 7th protests. And there's some family foundations, you know, a lot of smaller money from the various Muslim family foundations in the US, but also the Soros Foundation, for some reason, is big on these things. So, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be studied. So I believe in moving forward and doing it, and the studying while you're doing it. But the reason I've changed my mind, Irina, over the last 7 years on this is what's happened on the ground. That I used to be more concerned about the potential for overbroad implementation inside the US, and therefore its potential chilling effect on American Muslims. I think that's still a risk, but I think the greater risk now is not doing anything and allowing these things to grow and the terrorism to expand in, you know, inside the US. That risk is now outweighing it to me.
You know, I noticed one interesting thing. There's been a lot to be said about Iran's backing for Hamas, Iran's axis of resistance, not a lot about Iran's entanglement with Muslim Brotherhood, which is historically accurate, or Muslim Brotherhood's role in supporting Hamas and some of these other entities, which is also, you know, obviously there, but not being discussed. Iran is, Muslim Brotherhood isn't, and there hasn't been a lot of the push from the Jewish organizations concerned with the impact on of, you know, Hamas terrorism on Jewish American citizens who've been critical. So my question is, why is there this in terms of the private sector, non-governmental institutions, organizations. Why is there such a lack of interest? And your article is one of the very few that I've seen touching on the subject in recent years, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, people are afraid that they'll be ostracized. If they're at all left of center, the Muslim Brotherhood people have penetrated all these things, and I mean, they'll be ostracized. They don't want to. They don't want to talk about it because it's a difficult conversation, and so just avoid it. Meanwhile, the networks grow, and I don't care. I believe, we need to respond to what's happening. To me, the biggest risk out there right now, Irina, is business as usual. October 7th happens, and a horrific attack. Israel, of course, responds militarily to the threat. But the outbreak of violence and intimidation in the US, there seems to be no counter measures taken, and there needs to be. I mean, that we need to understand that it's no longer business as usual. But you mentioned these American Jewish organizations. I don't see them responding in any action sense at all. They're doing business as usual. They're scared, and they talk about it, and they describe the problems, and it's a woe is me, it's a Lamentations,
Sure.
chapter 2, but very little analysis, as you said, very little understanding of the nature of the threat that's now in front of them, that their children are facing in college campuses, that they face in their professional affiliations. That needs to be addressed, and now, and not waited. And it's been a year. And so that's why I wrote the articles. Maybe it'll shake a few people up. And I think, frankly, even if the American Jewish community, which is bereft of leadership, to be frank, and has been for a while, but even if it fails to rise to the challenge, I think the U.S. government needs to, and I think will. So, particularly if there's a Trump administration. But let's remember, even if there's Democrats in charge, this is still the measure they should be. Now, they're going to find it harder because they have domestic coalitions that include
Sure.
Muslim Brotherhood supporters. So, but they should. But anyway, it's been great talking with you.
One
And
last
thank you.
question, and I saved the best for last. What do you
Okay.
think is the best way to get American Muslims opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood on
Yeah.
board with any such advocacy? Because I just don't really see it happening without American Muslims being actively engaged and involved, and many of them are quite simply afraid.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, I completely agree. I set up this national network of Muslim Jewish advocacy, and worked together while I was at American Jewish Committee. And so I got to know them very well, and I have many friends in that community. And of course, their leaders, you talk about the American Jewish community being bereft of leadership. Oh my Lord, the American Muslim community is even worse, sad to say. They have failed, with very few exceptions. And I would give a shout out to Imam Talib Sharif of Washington, D.C., who's from the African American Muslim community, who's been very forthright. But most, and Anila Ali, there have been a few voices, a Pakistani American woman, Anila Ali, a few people have spoken out, but the organizations are pro-Hamas. It's not just that they're silent, they're not silent. CARE, which is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, came out on October 8th, the next day, in support of the massacres. And it's the largest Muslim American advocacy group. Shame on them. And people that we have affiliated with in these AJC and other groups have been silent, or have either been silent or supported Hamas. And that's the fact. And it's sad and painful even. But we need to start afresh. You cannot just disengage, but I think you disengage with the haters
Sure.
and you disengage from the people that were silent. And even if, my initial theory on Muslim Jewish outreach and coalition is, the Muslim Jewish side is very well organized, has large organizations. So I looked for counterparts on the Muslim side. And I said, look, let's just go for the largest runs, and eventually, we'll form friendships and we can find common ground. I no longer believe that because of what happened. Because I'm reflecting on actual experiences. And the large Muslim organizations, be it ISNA, be it CARE, be it a few others, including the one Mgage, the one that's a counterpart to CARE. There are a few others. None of them have shown any courage or any ability to speak out against Hamas. In fact, like I said, some of them have been pro-Hamas and raising money for Hamas-affiliated causes. So, and the largest Muslim charity in the U.S., which is Relief USA, but based in Houston, has not been helpful at all on any of this. So, I think you find the voices that you can work with and help raise them up. That's what you do on that. So ignore, you cannot, we've gone through this test. We don't want to do it a second time. There was a test on October 7th in the aftermath, and the Muslim organizations all failed that test of allyship. They supported terrorists or they were silent. And that's a fact. I wish it weren't, but it is. And, it's fine to be pro-Palestinian nationalism. It's not fine to be pro-terrorism. And they, unfortunately, they failed. So with a few exceptions, like I said, Talib Sharif and a few others, my friend Suhail Khan, I believe feels exactly the same as me. And so we'll watch this space. We'll be doing something in this space, but it won't be with the major Muslim organizations. So
thank you so much for this, and I couldn't agree
you're
more.
welcome.
I think this is more than necessary to try to identify at least courageous individuals who can make small steps in this complex environment, and hopefully the more awareness there is of why the Muslim Brotherhood is a problem, the more institutional we can fight against it, and the more that will empower voices in the Muslim community who right now have no real platform or real support. And with that, thank you so much for joining us. Those watching, thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m., the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Have a great evening.
Thank you.